On a heavy morning with a closed sky and still air, a rich man drives across his farm in a pickup truck, never looking to the sides. In the back seat, a quiet 3-year-old girl holds a stuffed toy in both hands. He reaches a remote, overgrown area covered in rust, where the ruins of an old snake den still remain. Without hesitation, he opens the gate and pushes the girl inside. In the distance, a white horse among the trees lifts its head and watches. When the truck disappears around the curve, the horse starts to approach, and what happens next? No one is ready to see. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and never miss one. Thanks for joining us. Now, back to our story. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above Blackwood Ranch, a vast expanse of land that rolled from the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains down to the winding silver ribbon of Clearwater Creek. For generations, the Blackwood name had commanded respect throughout Ravalli County, not just for the sheer size of their holdings, but for the way they had stewarded the land with reverence. That was until Mason Blackwood passed, leaving everything to his only son, Ethan. Ethan Blackwood stood on the porch of the main house, his steely gaze sweeping across the property he now controlled. Unlike his father, whose weathered hands had worked alongside every ranch hand until his final days, Ethan's palms were smooth, more accustomed to the sleek surfaces of corporate boardrooms than rough-hewn fence posts. At 38, he had reluctantly returned from Boston after 15 years of self-imposed exile, from what he had always considered his father's backward way of life. Quarterly projections are down 8% from last year, he muttered to himself, scrolling through spreadsheets on his tablet, inefficiencies everywhere. The morning air carried the scent of pine and fresh hay, but Ethan barely noticed. Where others saw beauty, he saw only assets to be managed, numbers to be improved. He had inherited everything: 12,000 acres, a breeding program for quarter horses that had won national recognition, a staff of 24, and debts that he considered unnecessary sentimentality on his father's part. Inside the barn, a different kind of inheritance was taking place. 4-year-old Emma Hayes sat cross-legged on a bale of hay, her small hands carefully holding out an apple toward the pale golden palomino that approached with gentle caution. The horse, known as Whisper, lowered his magnificent head, his velvet muzzle delicately taking the offering. "That's it, Whisper," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's okay." The child's presence at Blackwood Ranch was itself the result of tragedy. Her father, Jake Hayes, had been Mason Blackwood's foreman for over a decade. 3 months ago, a flash flood had swept through a remote part of the property. While Jake was checking on stranded cattle, they found his truck 2 days later, but Jake was gone, taken by the merciless current. Emma's mother had died during childbirth, and with no immediate family to claim her, Emma had temporarily been placed under the care of the ranch until her distant relatives in Minnesota could be located and arrangements made. Ruth Simmons, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Blackwood family for over 40 years, had taken Emma under her wing. Ruth understood that the child's grief expressed itself not in tears or tantrums, but in silence. For weeks after her father's disappearance, Emma hadn't spoken a word. It was only when Ruth brought her to the stables that something shifted in the child's hollow eyes. Whisper had been Mason Blackwood's prized stallion, a champion with a bloodline that traced back to some of the finest quarter horses in American history. But beyond his impressive pedigree, there was something almost supernatural about Whisper's intuition. The normally proud stallion had approached the silent child with such careful tenderness that even the most hardened ranch hands had felt their throats tighten at the sight. Day after day, Emma would sit with Whisper, Sometimes she'd read books out loud in her soft, halting voice. Other times, she'd simply lean against his warm flank, her tiny frame rising and falling with the horse's steady breathing. Slowly, words returned to her. Small smiles occasionally brightened her face. Ruth called it healing. The ranch hands called it a miracle. Ethan Blackwood called it a waste of resources. "That animal costs more to maintain than any 3 horses combined," he had complained to the stable manager. "And now it's become some kind of glorified babysitter. When is that kid being shipped off anyway?" The stable manager, Carlos Mendez, had worked at Blackwood Ranch since he was 16. Now in his 50s, he had known Ethan since he was a boy and wasn't intimidated by the new owner's corporate demeanor. "Whispers earned his keep 10 times over, Mr. Blackwood," Carlos had replied evenly, "and he seems to be the only thing keeping that little girl together right now." This morning, as Emma communed with Whisper in the quiet sanctuary of the stables, Ethan Blackwood strode through the sliding doors, the harsh light from outside cutting across the dim interior. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the concrete floor, an alien sound among the soft rustles of hay and gentle nickering of horses. "Ruth!" he called out, his voice echoing. "Where are you? I need the file on the Peterson deal." Emma, startled at the intrusion, instinctively pressing closer to Whisper's side. The horse shifted his massive body slightly, positioning himself between the child and the approaching man. Ruth emerged from a tack room, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Blackwood, I left those papers in your office last night, just as you asked." Ethan's gaze shifted from Ruth to Emma, then to Whisper. His mouth tightened into a thin line. "Why is she in here again? Didn't I make it clear that the stables are off limits without supervision? These aren't pets, they're investments." Ruth straightened her shoulders despite her arthritis. "I am supervising her, Mr. Blackwood." Emma finds comfort with Whisper. "And your father always—" "My father is gone," Ethan cut her off coldly. "And his way of running things went with him. This is a business now, not a charity or a petting zoo." Emma's small fingers twisted in Whisper's mane, her eyes wide with apprehension. The horse remained perfectly still, only his ears flicking back and forth, registering the tension in the air. "The girl needs to understand boundaries," Ethan continued, lowering his voice but not its intensity. "And that horse is worth too much to be treated like a playground attraction. I've got a buyer interested in him from Kentucky, could be looking at a 6-figure sale." Ruth's weathered face paled. "You can't sell Whisper. He was your father's pride." "I can and will make whatever business decisions are necessary," Ethan interrupted again. "Sentimentality is a luxury this operation can no longer afford." As if understanding the nature of their conversation, Whisper shifted his weight, his intelligent eyes fixed on Ethan. The horse's usual calm demeanor seemed charged with something more primal, a protective energy that radiated from his powerful frame. Emma, sensing the shift, looked up at Whisper, then back to Ethan. For the first time since the man's arrival at the ranch, she spoke directly to him. "Whisper doesn't like when people are mean," she said, her voice small but clear. "Daddy said animals know good people." Ethan's expression flickered with something between surprise and irritation. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a child who barely reached his knee. "Animals don't know anything," he replied dismissively. "They respond to food and training, that's all. And speaking of training, it seems you could use some yourself about respecting adults and private property." Ruth moved toward Emma protectively. "Mr. Blackwood, she's just a child who's lost everything. Surely you can find some compassion." "What I can find," Ethan said, checking his watch impatiently, is increasingly poor management of resources and time. I have investors visiting next week, and I want this place running like a proper business. By then, that means clear boundaries, defined roles, and no children wandering wherever they please. Am I making myself clear? The silence that followed was broken only by Whisper's soft snort, a cloud of warm breath visible in the cool morning air. The horse hadn't moved, but there was a new alertness to his posture, a gathering of energy beneath his golden coat. Emma's lower lip trembled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stroked Whisper's neck with a deliberate gentleness that seemed beyond her years, as if she were comforting him rather than seeking comfort. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood," Ruth finally answered, her voice tight, perfectly clear. As Ethan turned to leave, satisfied that his authority had been established, Emma whispered something to Whisper. The horse lowered his head until his muzzle touched the top of her head, an almost benediction-like gesture. Ethan paused at the doorway, glancing back at the tableau. The small, vulnerable child and the powerful animal joined in a moment of perfect understanding. Something stirred in him, a distant memory of his own childhood on the ranch, of his father's patient hands teaching him to ride, to respect the land and its creatures. But he pushed the memory away. Sentiment was weakness. His business professors had taught him efficiency was everything. "1 week," he announced to Ruth's back. "That's how long we have until the social worker comes for her final visit. Make sure everything is in order. I won't have my operations disrupted by bureaucratic complications." After Ethan left, the barn seemed to exhale collectively. Ruth knelt beside Emma, her arthritic knees protesting against the hard floor. "Don't you worry, sweetheart," she murmured, tucking a strand of honey-colored hair behind Emma's ear. "Mr. Mason would never let anything happen to Whisper, and neither will we." But as the words left her lips, Ruth wondered if she could keep that promise. Mason Blackwood had been a force of nature in these parts, his word as solid as the mountains themselves. His son, however, operated by different laws of profit and loss, with no column for measuring the worth of a child's healing heart or a loyal animal's spirit. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, casting long shadows across Blackwood Ranch. A cold wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and changing seasons. Inside the warm sanctuary of the stable, Emma pressed her cheek against Whisper's neck, finding in his steady heartbeat the only certainty in her suddenly uncertain world. The storm that had been threatening for days finally unleashed its fury. On Blackwood Ranch, rain lashed against the windows of the main house, where Ethan Blackwood sat in his father's old office, now stripped of its Western charm and transformed into a sterile workspace. 3 empty coffee cups littered the desk as he pored over financial reports. "Sir?" A hesitant knock at the door preceded Carlos Mendez's entrance. Water dripped from his rain slicker onto the polished hardwood floor. Ethan didn't look up. "The south pasture fence needs reinforcing before this weather gets worse. Take Peterson and Rodriguez." "Actually, sir, I came to talk about Whisper." Carlos removed his soaked hat, turning it nervously in his weathered hands. "There's a problem." This got Ethan's attention. "What kind of problem? Is he injured?" His tone suggested concern not for the animal's welfare, but for its market value. "No, sir. He's refusing to eat. Going on 2 days now. Won't let anyone near him except the Hayes girl." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous. He's an animal, not some lovesick teenager. Adjust his feed, check for colic, do whatever you need to do." "We've tried everything, Mr. Blackwood. Doc Wilson came by yesterday, says there's nothing physically wrong with him." Carlos paused, choosing his words carefully. "He thinks it might be emotional." "Emotional?" Ethan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Next you'll tell me he needs therapy. This is exactly the kind of nonsense my father encouraged that's been running this place into the ground." Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the room in stark white light. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "Your father understood these animals," Carlos said, a rare edge creeping into his voice. "Especially Whisper. That horse helped build this ranch's reputation. Without him..." "Without him," Ethan interrupted, "we'll still have 23 other horses that actually earn their keep without dramatic displays." He stood gathering his papers. "Where's the girl now?" "With Ruth in the kitchen. They're baking cookies, I think." Ethan nodded. Decision made. "Keep Whisper isolated. No visitors, especially not Emma. I won't have a child reinforcing whatever behavioral issue he's developing. My buyer is flying in next Tuesday, and I want that horse in prime condition." Carlos opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. After 34 years at Blackwood Ranch, he knew when arguments were futile, but as he turned to leave, he couldn't help adding, "Mason would never have sold Whisper. Some things aren't just about money, Mr. Blackwood." Alone again, Ethan stared out the window at the rain-drenched landscape. His father's name had become a constant rebuke since his return. Mason would never, Mason always. Mason believed, as if his father's way of doing things had been perfect when the books clearly showed otherwise. The ranch had been losing money for years, maintained more by Mason Blackwood's reputation than sound business practices. "I'm not here to be loved," Ethan muttered to himself. "I'm here to fix your mistakes, old man." In the warm kitchen, Emma stood on a stool beside Ruth, carefully pressing a cookie cutter into rolled dough. The radio played softly in the background, occasionally interrupted by static as the storm interfered with reception. "Can I take some cookies to Whisper?" Emma asked, her small face serious with concentration. "He likes sugar." Ruth smiled gently. "Horses shouldn't have too many sweets, dear, but maybe one special cookie." She glanced toward the window, frowning at the worsening weather. "Though, we might have to wait until this rain lets up." Emma's forehead creased with worry. "But he's sad today. I can feel it." Ruth had learned not to dismiss Emma's intuitions about Whisper. The connection between the child and the horse sometimes seemed to transcend normal understanding. "He'll be all right until morning," Ruth assured her, though her own concern had been growing. She'd seen Whisper that morning, standing motionless in his stall, refusing even his favorite treats. Only when Emma had appeared did the horse show any animation, gently nuzzling the child's hair as she wrapped her small arms around his leg. The kitchen door swung open, and Ethan entered, bringing with him the scent of rain and expensive cologne. His gaze swept over the domestic scene with barely concealed impatience. "Miss Simmons, I need the files on the Thompson property. And please clean up this mess when you're done. The real estate agent will be here tomorrow." Ruth wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron. "The Thompson files are in the second drawer of the filing cabinet, right where you asked me to put them yesterday." Her tone was respectful but cool. "And we'll have the kitchen spotless before we're finished." Emma watched Ethan with wary eyes, unconsciously moving closer to Ruth. Since their confrontation in the stable, she had taken to avoiding the ranch's new owner whenever possible. Ethan nodded, then focused on Emma with sudden intensity. "I understand you've been visiting the stables without permission again." Emma's small shoulders stiffened. "Whisper needs me." "Whisper is a horse, not a person," Ethan replied flatly, "and horses don't need anything except proper care, which my staff provides. From now on, the stables are off limits to you, unless accompanied by Ruth or myself. Is that clear?" Ruth placed a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "Mr. Blackwood, surely that's not necessary. Emma's presence seems to calm Whisper, and Carlos mentioned he's not been eating." "I've discussed the situation with Carlos," Ethan cut her off. "This attachment is becoming problematic for everyone involved. The social worker will be here next week to finalize Emma's placement with her relatives in Minnesota. It's better for her to start detaching now." At the mention of Minnesota, Emma's face crumpled, though no tears fell. Her relatives there, a second cousin of her father's and his wife, were strangers to her. The thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Whisper, was almost too much to bear. "I don't want to go," she whispered, looking down at her flour-dusted hands. "Daddy wouldn't want me to." A muscle in Ethan's jaw twitched. "Your father would want you to be with family. And speaking of family obligations, I'm carrying out mine by ensuring this ranch survives. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions." The storm outside intensified, rain hammering against the windows like angry fists. Thunder boomed, closer now, and Emma flinched. "Ruth, please finish up here and make sure Emma understands the new rules." Ethan turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and I've decided to move up the sale. My buyer will be here tomorrow instead of Tuesday. Make sure my guest room is prepared." Ruth's expression hardened. "You're really going through with selling Whisper after everything Carlos told you?" Ethan's gaze was steady, unflinching. "The decision is made. Bradford is offering $30,000 above market value, and he has connections to the national circuit that could benefit our breeding program." 30 pieces of silver, Ruth murmured, so quietly that Ethan almost missed it. He chose to ignore the biblical reference. "I expect full cooperation from all staff tomorrow. No dramatic scenes, no interventions. This is business, nothing more." After he left, Ruth turned to find Emma gone from her side. The back door stood slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. "Emma!" Ruth called out in alarm, hurrying to the door. Rain slashed sideways across the porch, already pooling on the wooden boards. Through the curtain of water, she could just make out a small figure running toward the stables, golden hair plastered to her head. Ruth grabbed her raincoat from the hook by the door and hurried after her, her old bones protesting against the sudden movement and the cold. By the time she reached the stables, she was soaked to the skin and breathing hard. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and horses enveloped her. "Emma!" she called, her voice barely audible over the storm raging outside. A soft sound drew her attention to Whisper's stall at the far end. There, curled against the horse's flank, sat Emma. Her clothes were drenched, but her expression was one of fierce determination as she stroked the Palomino's neck with gentle, rhythmic movements. "He can't go away," Emma said simply when she saw Ruth. "He belongs here, with me." Ruth approached slowly, noting with concern how Whisper stood protectively over the child, his normally gentle eyes watchful and alert. The horse hadn't eaten in 2 days, yet here he was, standing guard over this small human who had claimed his heart. "Oh, sweetheart," Ruth sighed, kneeling despite her aching joints. "I know this is hard, but sometimes we can't stop changes, even when they hurt." Emma shook her head stubbornly. "Daddy said Blackwoods always keep their promises. Mr. Mason promised me I could stay with Whisper until I felt better." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm not better yet." Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes. It was true. Mason Blackwood had made that promise in the days after Jake's disappearance, when Emma had finally shown the first sign of life by responding to Whisper. Ruth had been there, had seen the old rancher kneel before the traumatized child and pledge that Blackwood Ranch would be her sanctuary for as long as she needed it. But Mason was gone now, and his son operated by a different code. "Come back to the house, dear," Ruth urged gently. "You'll catch cold out here, and that won't help Whisper or anyone else." Emma's small hand tightened in Whisper's mane. "He's scared too. He knows something bad is happening." As if confirming her words, Whisper shifted uneasily, his ears flicking back and forth. The storm outside reached a crescendo, wind howling through the cracks in the old wooden structure. Ruth was about to insist when heavy footsteps announced a new arrival. Ethan Blackwood stood in the stable doorway, his silhouette backlit by a flash of lightning. His expression, when visible, was cold with fury. What part of off-limits was unclear, he demanded, striding toward them. This is exactly the kind of defiance I will not tolerate on my property. Whisper's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The horse moved with surprising quickness, positioning his body between Emma and the approaching man. His ears flattened against his head, and a low, warning sound rumbled in his chest. Ethan stopped short, momentarily taken aback by the animal's protective stance. "Get that horse under control," he ordered Ruth. "And bring the girl back to the house immediately." Ruth rose slowly to her feet, her wet clothes clinging uncomfortably to her thin frame. "Mr. Blackwood, perhaps this isn't the best time for—" "I wasn't asking for your opinion," Ethan cut her off. "I gave an order, and I expect it to be followed. This ranch operates under my authority now, not my father's outdated sentimentality." Something in Ruth seemed to snap at his words. 40 years of loyal service, of loving the Blackwood family as her own, of believing in what Blackwood Ranch stood for, all of it crystallized into a moment of fierce courage. "Your father's outdated sentimentality built everything you're so eager to dismantle," she said, her voice steady despite her shivering. He understood that some bonds can't be severed by spreadsheets and business plans. That child has lost everything, and that horse is the only thing keeping her spirit alive. If you can't see that, then you're blind to what truly matters in this world. Ethan's face darkened. "I've had enough of this insubordination. Pack your things, Miss Simmons. Your services are no longer required at Blackwood Ranch." Emma gasped, pressing closer to Whisper, who remained vigilant, his body tense and ready. Ruth straightened her bent shoulders. "If that's your decision, so be it, but I won't leave that child tonight." "You don't have a choice," Ethan replied coldly. "I want you gone within the hour. Carlos can drive you to town." Outside, the storm seemed to gather its strength, as if nature itself were responding to the human drama unfolding within the stable's walls. Rain pounded against the roof like 1,000 angry fists, and wind shrieked through every crack and crevice. Emma began to cry then, silent tears streaming down her face as she clung to Whisper's mane. The horse lowered his head to nuzzle her. Hair, a gesture so tender it would have moved a heart of stone. But Ethan Blackwood's heart had hardened long ago against such scenes. He saw only disobedience, only challenges to his authority, only obstacles to his vision of efficient, profitable operation. "Emma," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of the storm, "come here now. This childish behavior ends tonight." For the first time, Emma looked directly at him, her tear-streaked face set in an expression of quiet defiance that echoed her father's determination, a trait Jake Hayes had been known and respected for throughout the county. "No," she said simply, "Whisper needs me." It was the wrong moment for defiance. Ethan Blackwood, frustrated by weeks of resistance to his plans, isolated by his own choices, and now openly challenged by a 4-year-old child, felt something snap within him. In 3 long strides, he reached the stall door and yanked it open. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Whisper reared slightly, his front hooves lifting off the ground in warning. Ethan faltered, momentarily intimidated by the horse's display. Emma screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror, and Ruth lunged forward, placing herself between the man and the child. "Enough!" Ethan roared, regaining his composure. "This ends now!" And in that moment, with the storm raging around them and tensions at their breaking point, Ethan Blackwood made a decision that would change everything. A decision born not of reason, but of frustrated authority, not of justice, but of power. "It's your things," Ethan ordered Emma, his voice tight with barely contained rage. 5 minutes, then I'm going to show you what happens when you disobey the rules on my ranch." Ruth stepped forward, her thin frame somehow imposing in its righteousness. "Mr. Blackwood, whatever you're thinking, I beg you to reconsider. She's just a child. A child who needs to learn respect." He cut her off. "And since you've clearly failed to teach her that, I'll handle it myself." Emma clung to Whisper, her small fingers buried in his golden mane. The horse remained unnaturally still, his intelligent eyes fixed on Ethan with an awareness that seemed almost human. "I won't leave him," Emma whispered. Something dangerous flashed in Ethan's eyes. Without another word, he strode forward, reached over the stall door, and grabbed Emma's arm. The child cried out in surprise and fear. What happened next would later be described by Ruth as divine intervention through horse sense. Whisper, gentle, patient Whisper, who had never shown aggression in all his years at Blackwood Ranch, lunged forward with startling speed, teeth bared in warning. He didn't bite, but the message was clear. The child was under his protection. Ethan jerked backward, nearly losing his balance. His face flushed with a dangerous combination of fear and humiliation. "That's it," he snarled. "That animal is dangerous. We're putting an end to this tonight." Before either Ruth or Emma could react, Ethan stormed to the wall where halters and leads hung on heavy iron hooks. He grabbed a lead rope and approached Whisper's stall again, this time with more caution. "What are you doing?" Ruth demanded, moving to block his path. "Teaching necessary lessons," Ethan replied coldly. "Now step aside, unless you want to lose more than just your job tonight." Ruth hesitated, torn between defiance and fear, not for herself, but for what might happen to Emma and Whisper if she pushed too far. In that moment of indecision, Ethan brushed past her. "Emma," he said with forced calm, "come out of that stall right now." The child shook her head, eyes wide with fear. "Fine." Ethan unlatched the stall door fully. "Then I'll come in." Ruth found her voice again. "Ethan Blackwood, your father would be ashamed." "My father is gone," Ethan shouted, his composure finally shattering, and his way of doing things died with him. "This is my ranch now, and everyone on it will follow my rules or face the consequences." With surprising quickness for a man more accustomed to boardrooms than barns, Ethan entered the stall. Whisper backed up, positioning himself between Ethan and Emma, who had retreated to the corner. "Move, you stupid animal," Ethan muttered, attempting to loop the lead rope around Whisper's neck. Whisper evaded his grasp with the natural grace of his breed. His ears were pinned back, nostrils flared, every line of his body signaling distress and warning. "Mr. Blackwood!" Carlos appeared at the stable entrance, rain dripping from his slicker. "What's happening here?" Ethan didn't turn. "Stay out of this, Mendez. This is between me and this disobedient child." Carlos assessed the situation in seconds. The frightened child, the protective horse, Ruth's desperate expression, and Ethan's dangerous anger. Unlike Ruth, Carlos had no family connection to the Blackwoods, nothing to lose but a job he could easily find elsewhere, given his reputation. "Sir," he said firmly, stepping forward, "I think you need to step back and calm down. Whatever's happened, this isn't the way to handle it." "I don't remember asking for your opinion," Ethan snapped, still trying to capture Whisper, who continued to maneuver protectively around Emma. Carlos exchanged a meaningful glance with Ruth. In that silent communication, a plan formed. Ruth slowly moved toward Emma while Carlos approached Ethan from behind. "Mr. Blackwood," Carlos tried again, his voice deliberately calm, "that horse is worth over $100,000. In his current state, you risk injury to him and yourself." This practical argument seemed to penetrate Ethan's anger where emotional appeals had failed. He paused, breathing heavily, rope still clutched in his hand. "The storm's getting worse," Carlos continued reasonably. "Flash flood warnings all over the county. We need to secure the lower pastures before we lose more cattle. Peterson and Rodriguez can't handle it alone." Ethan's business mind finally began to override his wounded pride. Financial loss was a language he understood far better than emotional appeals. "Fine," he said after a long moment. "Secure the pastures." His cold gaze fixed on Emma, who was trembling in the corner. "But this isn't over. When I return, there will be consequences." As Ethan backed out of the stall, Ruth quickly moved to Emma's side, wrapping a protective arm around the child's shoulders. Whisper remained vigilant, his body still positioned defensively. "Ruth," Ethan said from the stable doorway, "you have until morning to pack your things, and the girl stays in the main house tonight, away from this animal. Carlos, I expect you at the lower pasture in 10 minutes. After Ethan left, the 3 humans and 1 horse remained frozen in tableau, as if afraid any movement might bring him storming back. Finally, Carlos broke the silence. "This has gone too far," he said quietly. "Ruth, take Emma to your cottage. Pack what you need. I'll come for you when it's safe." Ruth nodded, understanding the unspoken plan. "What about Whisper?" Carlos approached the stall cautiously. Whisper was still agitated, his sides heaving with exertion and stress. "I'll make sure he's secure here for now. But after tonight..." He shook his head grimly. "After tonight, nothing will be the same." Emma, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke. "Whisper knows a place," she said softly. "A safe place. He showed me." The adults exchanged puzzled glances. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Ruth asked gently. "In the old woods past the creek," Emma explained, her small face serious. "There's a meadow with tall grass. Whisper took me there when I was sad. Mr. Mason knew about it too." Carlos's expression changed to one of recognition. "The Hidden Valley," he murmured. "Mason used to say it was the heart of Blackwood Ranch." "We can't just run away," Ruth protested weakly, though the idea held undeniable appeal. "Where would we go? What would we do?" "Henry Townsend," Carlos said decisively. "Jake's old friend from the sheriff's department. He needs to know what's happening here." Ruth nodded slowly. "You're right. This isn't just about a job anymore. It's about Emma's safety." Outside, the storm continued its assault on Blackwood Ranch, rain lashing against the weathered boards of the stable. Lightning illuminated the yard in stark flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. "Go to your cottage first," Carlos instructed Ruth. "Gather only what you absolutely need. I'll secure the lower pasture as Ethan ordered. We need to buy time. Then I'll bring my truck around the back way. We'll take Emma to Henry, and he can contact the social worker directly." Ruth hesitated. "And Whisper?" Carlos looked at the magnificent horse, now calmer but still alert. "I don't know," he admitted. "Ethan's determined to sell him. By tomorrow morning it might be too late." Emma, who had been listening carefully to the adults' conversation, suddenly spoke with a clarity beyond her years. "Whisper won't stay in a stall if I'm gone. Daddy said he jumped the fence twice when Mr. Mason was in the hospital." Carlos and Ruth exchanged surprised glances. "That's true," Carlos said slowly. "Mason was the only one who could ever keep him contained. After the heart attack last year, Whisper broke out twice trying to find him. A plan, dangerous, desperate, but perhaps their only option, began to form. "Ruth, take Emma now," Carlos decided. "I'll handle things here." As Ruth led Emma toward the stable door, the child paused to look back at Whisper. The horse nickered softly, a sound of reassurance that brought tears to Ruth's eyes. "We'll see you soon," Emma promised the Palomino, and something in her young voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. The journey across the rain-soaked yard to Ruth's small cottage was treacherous. The storm had intensified, transforming the ground into slick mud that threatened to pull their feet from under them with each step. Ruth held Emma close, using her own body to shield the child from the worst of the rain. Inside the cottage, Ruth moved with efficiency born of necessity. She grabbed an old duffel bag from the closet and filled it with essentials: warm clothes, a first aid kit, the emergency cash she kept in a coffee tin. For Emma, she packed the child's favorite stuffed rabbit, a change of clothes, and the photo of Jake that the girl kept beside her bed. "Put on your warmest clothes," Ruth instructed, helping Emma out of her wet garments and into dry ones. "We need to be ready when Carlos comes." As Emma dressed, Ruth peered anxiously out the window toward the main house. Lights blazed from Ethan's office, a harsh yellow glow against the storm's darkness. Would he check on them? Would he suspect their plan? "Ruth," Emma said suddenly, her small voice barely audible above the storm. "Whisper is coming." Ruth turned from the window in surprise. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" But before Emma could answer, a sound reached them, the unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats, heavy and determined, approaching the cottage. Ruth rushed to the door just in time to see Whisper materialize out of the rain like a golden apparition, his wet coat gleaming in the porch light. "Dear Lord," Ruth breathed. "How did he—" "I told you," Emma said simply, moving past Ruth to the door. "He knows." The horse stood steady in the downpour, steam rising from his powerful body. He lowered his majestic head as Emma approached, nickering softly in greeting. Ruth's mind raced. Carlos would be expecting them at the cottage, but with Whisper loose, everything had changed. Ethan would soon discover the horse missing. They had minutes, not hours. "Emma," she said urgently, "can Whisper really take us to that safe place you mentioned, the Hidden Valley?" Emma nodded without hesitation. "He knows the way, even in the dark." A lifetime of cautious decisions warred, with desperate necessity in Ruth's heart. Could she really trust the instincts of a 4-year-old child and a horse, even one as exceptional as Whisper? The alternative, waiting for Ethan to discover their plan, was unthinkable. Decision made, Ruth grabbed a raincoat for Emma and threw a shawl around her own shoulders. She quickly scribbled a note for Carlos, explaining their change of plans, and left it on the kitchen table. "We're going with Whisper," she told Emma, slinging the duffel bag across her body. "Can you show me how to climb up?" For the first time that terrible night, Emma's face brightened with something like joy. "He'll help us," she said confidently. Outside, Whisper seemed to understand their intent. The horse that had been trained for show rings and professional handlers now stood perfectly still as Ruth awkwardly boosted Emma onto his bare back. Then, with a grace that belied her 70 years, Ruth managed to pull herself up behind the child. "Hold on to his mane," Emma instructed seriously. "Not too tight, just enough to stay on." Ruth complied, one arm securely around Emma's waist, the other gently grasping the silky strands of Whisper's mane. The horse stood motionless until they were settled, then, without any visible command, began to move. They skirted the main yard, keeping to the shadows, Whisper's hooves surprisingly quiet on the sodden ground. Ruth's heart pounded with fear and an unexpected exhilaration. In all her decades at Blackwood Ranch, she had never ridden bareback through a storm, trusting her life to an animal's instincts. Yet here she was, fleeing with a child into the night, guided by a horse that seemed to understand their plight better than any human could. As they passed the main stable, Ruth saw Carlos emerging from the shadows, his expression changing from concern to astonishment as he spotted them. She raised one hand in a brief gesture, part farewell, part reassurance. He nodded once, understanding. He would cover their tracks as best he could. They reached the edge of the property, where the manicured pastures gave way to wilder terrain. Here, ancient cottonwoods and pines created a natural boundary between Blackwood Ranch and the state. Forest beyond, a small creek, now swollen with rainfall, cut across their path. Ruth tensed, uncertain how they would cross, but Whisper never hesitated. He carefully picked his way along the bank until he found a shallow crossing, testing each step before committing his weight. "He's so smart," Emma whispered, patting the horse's wet neck. "Daddy said he has old soul eyes." Ruth could only nod, too focused on keeping them balanced as Whisper navigated the treacherous crossing. The water swirled around his fetlocks, then his knees, but his steps remained sure and confident. Once across the creek, they entered the forest proper. The dense canopy provided some shelter from the rain, though water still dripped steadily from the laden branches. In the darkness, Ruth could barely make out the path they followed, but Whisper moved with the certainty of one traveling a familiar route. They climbed steadily, leaving the valley floor behind. The storm's fury seemed to lessen as they ascended, or perhaps it was just the protection of the ancient trees that surrounded them. Ruth had lost all sense of time and direction, putting her complete trust in the animal carrying them to safety. Finally, after what felt like hours, but might have been only 40 minutes, Whisper emerged from the forest into a small, sheltered valley. Even in the darkness and rain, Ruth could make out the contours of a meadow surrounded by protective ridges on 3 sides. At the far end, a dark shape resolved itself into a structure, an old line cabin built generations ago for ranch, hands tending the high pastures. "We're here," Emma said with quiet satisfaction. Whisper approached the cabin and stopped beside a lean-to shelter attached to its side. A simple roof supported by sturdy posts, open on 3 sides but offering protection from the elements. It was here that he came to a halt, standing perfectly still as Ruth carefully slid off his back, then lifted Emma down. The cabin door was secured with a simple latch, not a lock. Inside, Ruth found it surprisingly well maintained, a testament to Mason Blackwood's meticulous care of every corner of his ranch. There was a small wood stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot against one wall, and basic supplies stored in a cupboard. Matches, lanterns, canned food, blankets. "Your grandfather must have kept this place ready for emergencies," Ruth told Emma as she lit a lantern, casting a warm glow throughout the simple space. Emma nodded, unsurprised. "Mr. Mason brought me here once. He said it was a special place where people could rest when they were tired of fighting." Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes at this evidence of the old rancher's wisdom and foresight. How many troubled souls had found refuge in this hidden valley over the years? How many had Mason Blackwood sheltered here, away from judging eyes and harsh realities? Outside, Whisper had settled beneath the lean-to, apparently content with this arrangement. Ruth filled a bucket with rainwater for him and laid out some of the old blankets she found in a chest, creating a makeshift bed for Emma on the cot. As the child drifted into exhausted sleep, Ruth sat by the small window, watching the rain and thinking of the consequences tomorrow would bring. She had defied her employer, aided in the theft of valuable property, and fled with a child in state custody. By any legal standard, her actions were indefensible. And yet, watching the gentle rise and fall of Emma's chest, seeing the way Whisper kept vigilant watch even in his rest, Ruth knew she would make the same choice again. Some laws transcended those written by humans, laws of compassion, of protection, of doing what was right even when it was not easy. "Mason," she whispered, to the spirit of her old friend and employer, "I hope you're watching over us tonight. We could use some of your strength about now." Outside, the storm began to abate. The relentless drumming of rain on the cabin roof softened to a gentle patter, then to isolated drops. The wind, which had howled like a living creature, gradually quieted to occasional sighs through the pines. In the strange stillness that follows great storms, Whisper raised his head, ears pricked forward. Something had changed in the atmosphere, not just the weather, but something more elemental. The horse rose to his feet, moving to the edge of the lean-to's shelter. Ruth watched him through the window, puzzled by his sudden alertness. Then she heard it too, the distant sound of engines. Flashlight beams cut through the remaining darkness, bobbing and weaving among the trees below. The search had begun much sooner than she had anticipated. Ethan must have discovered their absence immediately, must have organized a search party, despite the dangerous conditions. Ruth's heart sank. She had hoped for more time for Henry Townsend to be notified, time for the proper authorities to intervene. Now they were trapped, with nowhere to run and no way to explain their desperate flight without condemning themselves in the process. But as the lights drew nearer, Whisper did something unexpected. Instead of retreating deeper into the sheltering lean-to, he moved purposefully into the open, his golden coat gleaming in the first faint light of dawn, breaking through the storm clouds. And as he stood there, proud and unafraid, something remarkable happened. The approaching light stopped their advance, the engines fell silent, and from the edge of the forest emerged not Ethan Blackwood and his hired men, but Carlos Mendez, Sheriff Henry Townsend, and a woman Ruth recognized as Jessica Morales, the county social worker assigned to Emma's case. Dawn was breaking over the hidden valley, casting long shadows and golden light across the rain-washed meadow. The storm had passed, and with it, the darkest hours of their ordeal. As Whisper stood sentinel between the cabin and the newcomers, Ruth felt a strange certainty take root in her heart. Whatever happened next, they were no longer alone in their fight. The silent, noble creature who had carried them through darkness and danger had done more than just rescue a frightened child. He had set in motion events that would change the course of all their lives forever. Sheriff Henry Townsend approached the cabin with deliberate steps, his weathered face set with concern beneath his rain-spattered hat. Behind him, Jessica Morales clutched a folder to her chest, professional composure barely concealing her anxiety. "Ruth," Henry called, his deep voice carrying across the meadow. "Everyone's been worried sick. You all right? The girl?" Ruth nodded, one hand still on the cabin door. "We're fine. Emma's sleeping." Sheriff Townsend stopped a respectful distance from Whisper, who remained positioned between the visitors and the cabin. The horse's stance wasn't threatening, but his message was clear. He was the guardian of this threshold. "That's quite an animal," Henry remarked quietly. "Carlos told us what happened." Jessica stepped forward. "Mrs. Simmons, I understand you. We're trying to protect Emma, but taking a child in state custody was the only option we had," Ruth finished firmly. "If you'd seen how Ethan was behaving." Henry held up a calming hand. "We're not here to make accusations," Carlos called. "Me last night told me everything. That's why we came ourselves instead of sending deputies." "Ethan doesn't know yet," Carlos added, approaching to stand beside Whisper. The horse allowed his presence, even lowering his head slightly to accept Carlos's gentle pat. "He's distracted with the storm damage and insurance adjusters." Inside the cabin, a small sound drew their attention. Emma stood in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her eyes widened at the sight of the sheriff. "Uncle Henry?" she said hesitantly. Henry's stern face softened immediately. "Hey there, pumpkin." Emma rushed from the doorway and into his open arms. He lifted her easily, holding her close as she buried her face in his shoulder. The bad man wanted to hurt Whisper, she mumbled. Henry's expression darkened. Nobody's going to hurt Whisper or you, Emma. That's a promise. Jessica watched this exchange with growing understanding. I was scheduled to make my final home visit today before recommending Emma's placement with her relatives in Minnesota. But given these developments, I believe we need to reassess the situation. Ruth stepped closer. Those people in Minnesota, they're barely related to Jake, second cousins who never even met Emma. Is that really what's best for her? My protocols require me to prioritize blood relatives, Jessica explained, though her tone lacked conviction. But there are exceptions when compelling evidence suggests an alternative placement would better serve the child's welfare. Emma, suddenly remembering her responsibilities, turned to check on Whisper. The horse lowered his head to her level, allowing her small hand to stroke his velvety muzzle. "See?" she said to Jessica with the simple logic of childhood. "He's my best friend." Jessica made a note in her file, then looked up with newfound determination. "Sheriff Townsend, would you be willing to provide a formal statement regarding Mr. Blackwood's behavior? And would you be willing to be considered as an alternative guardian for Emma? As her godfather, you would qualify under our placement guidelines." Henry looked down at Emma, then over at Whisper, then finally at Ruth. "I'm a single man with a demanding job, not exactly ideal parenting material." "You wouldn't be alone," Ruth said quietly. "I may have lost my position at Blackwood Ranch, but I haven't lost my ability to care for a child." "And Emma would need to visit Whisper," Carlos added. "That means working out some arrangement with the ranch." "Ethan Blackwood doesn't own every inch of Blackwood Ranch," a new voice interrupted. "Not anymore." All heads turned toward the forest path, where an elegant woman in her 60s emerged from the trees. Despite the muddy conditions, she navigated the terrain with confidence in practical hiking boots. "Margaret?" Ruth gasped in disbelief. Margaret Blackwood, Mason's widow and Ethan's mother, approached the group with measured steps. "When I got your message, Carlos, I caught the first flight back from Phoenix." Carlos nodded. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "My husband built this ranch on integrity and compassion," Margaret replied firmly. "I won't stand by and watch our son dismantle that legacy." She knelt to Emma's level. "Hello, Emma. I don't believe we've formally met. I'm Mrs. Blackwood." Emma regarded her curiously. "Mr. Mason's wife." "That's right." Margaret smiled sadly. "He wrote to me about you, said you had your daddy's courage and a special way with his favorite horse." Emma nodded solemnly. "Whisper saved me from the bad place." Margaret's expression darkened momentarily, then cleared. "I've spoken with our family lawyer. As per Mason's will, 40% of Blackwood Ranch remains in my name. Ethan may be managing operations, but he doesn't have unilateral authority to sell assets designated as heritage breeding stock." She approached Whisper, who watched her with intelligent curiosity. "And this magnificent creature was specifically named in Mason's personal codicil as foundation stock, never to be sold outside. The family breeding program." Hope began to blossom in Ruth's heart. "Margaret, does this mean—" "It means," Margaret said firmly, "that Whisper isn't going anywhere. And neither, I suspect, are you, Ruth." She turned to Jessica. "Ms. Morales, I'd like to formally propose an alternative arrangement." "I'm listening, Mrs. Blackwood." "The east pasture and the old foreman's house technically fall on my portion of the property. I'm offering that house to Sheriff Townsend and Ruth, rent-free for as long as they're caring for Emma. The property includes stables and 10 acres of good grazing land," Margaret continued, "sufficient for Whisper and perhaps a companion or two. Carlos has agreed to oversee their care as part of his regular duties." "That's very generous," Jessica began, "but there are legal considerations." All addressed in this proposal. Margaret handed her a thick envelope, drafted by our family lawyers this morning. The procession made its way from the hidden valley back to Blackwood Ranch, with Whisper and Emma in front, picking a careful path that avoided the worst of the storm damage. As they emerged onto the main access road, a black SUV roared toward them, skidding to a halt. Ethan Blackwood emerged, his expression thunderous. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, then spotted his mother. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Addressing a situation that should never have been allowed to develop," Margaret replied coolly. Ethan's gaze moved to Emma atop Whisper, and his face darkened further. "I see Ruth has roped everyone into her dramatic narrative. That dangerous. Horse carried that child to safety when you abandoned her in a storm," Henry said, stepping forward. "As Emma's godfather and an officer of the law, I'm formally notifying you that your actions are under investigation for child endangerment." Ethan paled slightly but rallied quickly. "You have no jurisdiction here." Actually," Jessica interjected, opening her folder, "as a representative of Montana Child Protective Services, I do have jurisdiction wherever a child's welfare is concerned." Before Ethan could respond, Whisper moved forward, placing himself between the arguing humans and Emma. The horse's stance wasn't aggressive, but it was unmistakably protective. Even Ethan fell silent, confronted by the wordless rebuke in the animal's steady gaze. "I think we've said enough for now," Henry suggested. "Margaret, should we proceed to the main house or the foreman's cottage?" "The foreman's house," Margaret decided, deliberately excluding Ethan. "Carlos, would you bring some supplies from the main house later? Ruth and Emma will be spending their first night there today." Ethan watched in impotent fury as the group bypassed him. Only his mother paused briefly beside him. "Board meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m., Margaret informed him quietly. "Until then, I suggest you reflect on what your father would have done in your position." The foreman's house, a sturdy two-story structure, had stood empty since Jake Hayes' disappearance. As Ruth unlocked the door and stepped inside, memories flooded back. She had helped Jake make this place a home after his wife's passing. Emma wandered into the front room, her small hand trailing along the stone fireplace. "Daddy used to make hot chocolate here," she said softly, "with the little marshmallows." Ruth blinked back tears. "That's right, sweetheart, and we can do that again." The day progressed with the organized chaos of establishing a new household. Neighbors, hearing of the situation through the rural grapevine, began arriving with casseroles, toolboxes, and extra hands. As the sun began its descent, Carlos led Whisper toward the house. Emma flew down the steps and across the yard, her earlier fatigue forgotten. Whisper quickened his pace, meeting her halfway, lowering his proud head to her level. "Welcome home," Emma whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. The next morning, as Emma greeted Whisper with joy, Margaret arrived carrying legal documents. "Emma, I have something important to tell you," she said gently. "Before your father was lost, he and my husband made an agreement. Mason wrote it down the week before he left us. It says that if anything ever happened to your father, Whisper would belong to you." Emma's eyes widened. "Whisper is mine?" "Legally and completely," Margaret confirmed. "Mason knew how special your connection was. He wanted to make sure you two would always be together." "There's more," she continued, showing Emma another document. "This establishes a trust fund for Whispers. Care everything he needs for his entire life. You and Ruth will make all decisions about his care, with help from Carlos." Emma grasped the essential point. "No one can take Whisper away? Ever?" "No one," Margaret confirmed. "Not even the owner of Blackwood Ranch." As if understanding the significance of this conversation, Whisper approached the porch, his intelligent eyes seeming to take in the scene with unusual awareness. Margaret watched him thoughtfully. My husband used to say there was something ancient in those eyes. Something that understood more than we could explain. Emma nodded in complete agreement. Whisper knows things, she said simply. That's why he found me in the dark place. That's why he brought us home. By evening, when Henry returned from his shift, the foreman's house had been transformed from an empty shell to a home filled with evidence of community care. Small towns, Henry remarked with wonder. Nothing like them when someone needs help. And Ethan? He asked quietly. Margaret called after the board meeting, Ruth replied. He's been placed on probation. Mason's brother is coming to co-manage until they're confident Ethan understands what Blackwood Ranch truly stands for. Outside, the Montana evening settled gently across the land. In the paddock beside the foreman's house, Whisper raised his head to catch the cooling breeze, his golden coat gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. Emma sat on the top rail of the fence, safe under Ruth's watchful eye, speaking to the horse in the quiet, confidential tone children reserve for their most trusted companions. What secrets they shared remained their mystery. But any observer would recognize the profound bond connecting them, a bond forged in loss, tempered by adversity, and now flourishing in the fertile ground of new beginnings. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emma's small voice carried clearly across the yard. "See, Whisper, I told you we'd find home again." The horse nickered softly in response, reaching his graceful neck over the fence to nuzzle her shoulder. In that simple gesture lay all the affirmation anyone could need, the wordless promise that some connections transcend explanation, that some guardians come to us on 4 legs instead of 2, and that healing often arrives in forms we never expected but somehow always needed. Dear listeners, we hope Emma and Whisper's journey has touched your heart and reminded you of the special bonds that can form between children and animals. If you were moved by this tale of courage, protection, and the healing power of connection, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit and the silent wisdom of our animal companions. Remember to like this video and share in the comments which moment moved you most. Every story we share is a reminder that even in our darkest hours, we are never truly alone when love guides the way.